Okay, remember we're continuing Ephesians. This is chapter 6, verse 1. And again, to keep in mind, this is Paul's ecclesiology. Ultimately, this is all about the church. And so to try and talk about it that way. Now, if you remember the last time we were talking about the women were supposed to be obedient and husbands were supposed to be loving. And so now we turn to the children. He says, children, be obedient to your parents in the Lord. That is right. I'd like you to notice that in the Lord. Most people don't kind of understand this, but do you know that, like, as a priest, I make a promise of obedience to the bishop? And my promise of obedience to the bishop is ultimately a promise to God, as his will is demonstrated in the bishop. Now, it isn't a matter of I can just, anything I don't like, say that obviously didn't come from God. You can't do that. But the idea is that the obedience, you cannot render obedience to a human being that way. You render obedience to God, and then how that's demonstrated in a human being. And that's true in an order. If you take a vow in an order, the vow is ultimately made to God as his will is expressed through the superior, okay? And so that's what he's saying is, children, be obedient to your parents in the Lord, so that to the degree your parent reflects the Lord. Like, for instance, if my parents wanted me to deliver drugs for them, that doesn't come from the Lord, okay? Now, depending on how old you are, whether you would know about that or anything, but as to the degree that something your parents ask you to do or something is not really in conformity with the Lord's will, you're not obliged to it at all. Secondly, it says, honor your father and your mother is the first commandment with a promise, so that you may prosper and have a long life. Now, we in the Roman Catholic Church, when we memorize the commandments, we memorize the shorter form. I'd like you to know the 10 Commandments, I think, are given 4 times in the Bible, and they're never the same twice, okay? And they're basically the same commandments, but the wording isn't the same. And in Protestant communities, they normally memorize the longer form, and the longer form says, honor your father and mother, for you will have the long life. You know, that sort of thing. You'll prosper and have a long life. And in the commandments, remember, that's unusual. He says it's the first commandment with a reward. Well, I think it's the only one. You know, like when if I were to take a cleaver and separate the teachings of Jesus from the teachings of the Jewish scriptures, it would have to do with exactly that, for instance, the 10 Commandments will say, thou shalt not kill, okay? And then the not into the commandments, but the text is very clear about the penalties for murder. And if you go into the Jesus thing, it says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Now, if you're trying to be merciful, you're certainly not going to be killing any people. But it is never worded negatively. It's all worded positively with rewards. And in human life, you know, the positive is rewarded and the negative is punished. If you look at a dog, a child, anything, positive is rewarded, the negative is punished. And it embodies exactly the same thing, but it's a way people choose to live. And what Jesus has called us is to be a people that are so about the goal that's before us that we move far away from what is prohibited, okay? So, like, for instance, if you take the commandment, in fact, the Jews had laws like this. They're second-generation laws. The commandment, you know, thou shalt not kill, you were allowed to beat a person with 40 lashes. No more than 40, because people had died with more than 40 lashes. So if there's 40 lashes, you haven't committed murder, okay, which is keeping the law. But you couldn't give 40 lashes and be keeping mercy, Okay? So this, the whole idea, that's why I think one of the horrible things, when I look back on my life, I tried endlessly and never achieved it. But I would love to have had a First Communion class 1 year who could speak the Beatitudes and not the commandments. I never did. And I would push for it, but you'd always have, everyone knew thou shalt nots, okay? But no one was ever, into the other. And the fact is, thou shalt nots are minimal and achievable. I'd be willing to bet most of us could stand before God and say, I never committed murder. If you look at the Ten Commandments carefully, I think they're precious few of them any of us break, okay? But when you go to the Beatitudes, no one's ever going to come before God and say, I was merciful. Because I don't care who you are, you could have been better. So one of the things of the Beatitudes, you'll never end up self-righteous. You end up much higher on the whole thing, but not self-righteous. Whereas the commandments, someone can say, well, I never committed murder, and just, and you almost hear this with politicians, they take great pride in the fact that they have never been caught in a lie, for instance, something like this, that, the idea is, have you ever been accused of telling the truth, But anyway, so to go on, but this idea, he says, and parents, do not provoke your children to anger, but nourish them with discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Notice this, nourish with discipline and instruction from the Lord. You need to find a way to draw people forward. One of the things that I most remember about my father was the ability to administer punishment that ended. I'll give you an example. We were at the zoo, visiting the zoo at one time in San Diego, and my dad was going to get my sister and I ice cream. So we were on our way over to get the ice cream, and I punched my sister. I mean, why does God give you a younger sister? To punch her, okay? So anyway, I punched her. My dad caught me and immediately swatted me. And then we went on to get the ice cream. And if you'd been at the ice cream stand, you would not have been able to tell who'd been punished and who hadn't. That it's just over. Now, it would be always punished, but it was over, simply over. And that I see that as this ability to nourish and discipline. And the other thing about this, do not provoke your children to anger, that a lot of people who get very upset with people who they have, let's say, control over. I'm thinking of pastors. I'm thinking of bosses. I'm thinking of all kinds of people who have authority. Oftentimes do not realize that what most angers them in others is exactly what they provoke them to do. They sort of push them to the edge and then get angry when they push back. It's just, and so in any kind of a reaction against you or anything, it's really good to be able to go through your mind and ferret out whether there's some way that I have provoked it, okay, to ferret it out and see if that can somehow be corrected. It isn't always true that you have, but at least look. He goes, slaves, be obedient to your earthly masters with respect and trembling in sincerity of heart, just as you are obedient to Christ. Not only when you're under their eyes as if to please human beings, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Now, you notice he said that if you're a child obeying a parent, it's conditioned by the parent speaking God's will. It's not if you're a slave. If you're a slave, he demands you be as obedient to that person as you would be to Christ. And the reason why he does that is that a slave has no control. So it would be very easy, for instance, as a woman, to end up a slave in a household and find yourself, a sexual slave. And to have great moral compunction about this, that this is sinful and this. If you're a slave and you end up a sexual slave, it is your master who is in fact the sinner, not you. You have no control over it. That's not true of children. Children have a relationship with their parents. A slave doesn't. A slave is like a tool or whatever. And so he says that if you're a slave, you must be at peace doing what you have to do, okay? Because that is not your position of control. And they oftentimes get on the back of Paul because he didn't, tirade against slavery. But the fact of the matter is, what Paul is trying to do is to teach us how to live in the world in which we live. And just to give you one example, I don't know how many of you know or have ever heard the name Hunthausen. Hunthausen was the archbishop in Spokane. He was one of the, probably Spokane. But anyway, he was the archbishop, and he was just a firebrand and a meticulous man. He probably was put in jail 25 times while he was bishop. Anytime the United States sailed a nuclear submarine into Puget Sound, he would follow it with a rowboat and be right on top of it all the time until he was arrested. And each year, when his taxes were complete, he sent in his taxes minus the percentage of his taxes that would go to armaments in the war, which were donated to something else. Of course, the government took it out of his bank account anyway. But I mean, this was a man who was really, really, committed to that sort of thing, and he was able to do it. He was able to do it. But a slave can't do that. As a slave, you really can't do that. And this other thing about not just when you're under their eyes, as if to please human beings, but remember, in your service to your master, you're really pleasing Christ in that thing. You have no control over it, so you do what you as the slave. Okay? He says, work willingly as for the Lord and not for human beings, aware that everyone, whether slave or free, will be rewarded by the Lord for whatever work has been done well. And so if you're a slave, you don't get to determine your work, but you do get to determine whether you do it well. And so that's what you're called to do in the presence of God, okay? So as a free person, I'm called to do a good work and do it well. As a slave, you're called to do whatever you're ordered to do and to do it well. And we were talking before the class a little bit about I will call the religion of food in France. That if you go to a very simple meal in a home and something, they're always served with pizzazz. They're excited. The cook is excited about what they've cooked, and they put real effort into the way it looks and all this sort of thing. And there's something very contagious about a person who enjoys what they're doing and does it well. And no matter what they're doing. When as an adult, one of the things that really fascinated me is children's hobbies. Now, children don't have hobbies now, they have phones. But they used to have hobbies. But you would go into a home and the kid would tell you he collected bugs. Well, he could tell you more about bugs than anyone. He'd be so excited to show you that. It was amazing, Or they collect rocks or butterflies or whatever, and stamps. And they go through this whole thing. And to me, as an adult, I have an excellent education. But you never talk to a kid with a hobby, you don't learn something. Never. And that this great involvement, it was fascinating. But I think that's one of the things that most appeal to us, like we talk about Matthew. He's very good at what he does. He's very intentional at how he does. And he loves it. He absolutely loves it. And that's something we communicate. And I think one of the things that we've noticed in this thing, this whole letter, is the gospel of Jesus Christ is not a written document. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a human being who walks the face of the earth. And you and I embody that. I quoted this before, but it comes from Bernstein's Mass, and he's describing basically Daniel Berrigan. The Berrigan brothers went to jail for protesting the war, the Vietnam War. They were both priests. And so they were Maryknoll priests, and they went to jail. But anyway, the commentary in Bernstein's Mass on them, the particular verse that refers to them is, "Go and lock up your bold men and hold men in tow. You can silence all adventure for a century or so. Smother hope before it's risen. Make it wizen like a gourd. But you cannot stop the word of the Lord." And that's because the word of the Lord is a person. So you can lock him up, you can forbid him to preach, you can do anything you want. The gospel is right there. And that's the thing for us to remember all about this, that ultimately in hearing all this stuff, it's the way we carry it into life, and to carry it happily, enthusiastically and stuff into life. One of the things I'm disappointed with right now is that they're, are lifting they lifted the Sunday obligation, and they're restoring it now. And one of the things that really changed about Mass when that was gone is that you didn't have people at church who didn't want to be there. And that's very different celebrating Mass with people who want to be there. That's why I actually prefer daily Masses to Sunday Masses, that you have nothing there but people who want to be there. And that there's something powerful about a person very involved with God who enjoys it and lives it. And that's what draws people. That actually draws people. So, going on, he says, and masters, do the same for them, putting threats aside, aware that they and you will have the same master in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Okay? So now, if you're a master of slaves, it's very different now. As a master, you have to stop threatening them and stop punishing them. Put threats aside, aware that you and they have the same master. You know that when I was a youngster and going through the seminary and everything, that in a parish, you had a pastor and you had assistants. And the way the structure in the church goes is you have the Pope, and the people who the Pope is in charge of is the bishops. But no bishop is over another bishop, okay? And the bishops are over the pastors, okay? And the pastors are over the associates. That's the structure. Vatican II changed that. Vatican II says you have the Pope over the bishops are over all the priests. And the pastor who is in charge of a parish has associates, but the associates work for the bishop, as the pastor works for the bishop. So it's a very big change in structure. And when I was going through the seminary, it was all this assistance thing. Well, you know, as a pastor who, like, by the time I came out of the seminary, it was all legally associates. Although for everyone I served under, I was an assistant because they weren't into the new thing at all. But as an associate, you deal with people differently than you do as a pastor with an assistant, okay? So the ministry of the bishop is to be extended to the parish through the clergy, okay? It isn't the ministry of the pastor that's extended. And as I was the associate of Martin here at the parish, and let's say I was insisting on celebrating the Latin Mass, Martin would tell the bishop, and the bishop would be responsible to react for it. Or if he were doing it, I could tell the bishop, and the bishop would be responsible for doing it, because the bishop's in charge of them. But the pastor is not in charge of the associate, and the associate's not in charge of the pastor. I should tell you, under the new system, associates actually have more power than a pastor. And one of the reasons is, if they don't like you, they leave, go to another parish, and you have no associates, okay? In a big parish like this, that would be a disaster, okay? So, this idea, and to remember that when we come before God, there is no favoritism. One of the things that I really liked when I was a member of a religious order is that in a religious order, when you, let's say you finished being pastor of a parish, your next assignment is as an associate. And then when another parish opens up, you'll be made the next pastor. It passes on that way. But if I'm your pastor, when I'm ordering you around in the parish, I need to know that I could be your associate, your assistant one day. So in the religious orders, the assistant business worked very differently than it did in diocesan parishes. If you're a pastor in a diocesan parish, you'll never be other than a pastor. But not in the religious order, even to this day. If you're in the parish and the time comes to be transferred, you're transferred as an associate and then begin as the thinking. Okay? So now, having put on all this, Paul goes through probably one of the I think, finest sort of analogies of preparedness. So he says, finally, grow strong in the Lord with the strength of his power. Now, notice that as a member of the church, I'm supposed to go strong in the Lord, but with his power. Like when you and I come into the church, all of us bring gifts. We all have particular gifts. And it is the duty of a pastor of a parish to identify and use gifts in a parish. That's kind of how it's supposed to work. But you and I are supposed to submit our gifts actually to the leader of the parish who decides this. Now, I think it is something against the whole spirit of the deal that, let's say, dancing isn't allowed in the church. Because for many people, that is the gift they have. And they bring that to the church, and there's no place for it. Well, to me as a pastor, if I'm a pastor and someone has a gift they want to present to the church, it's my duty to find a place where that can be presented. And it's there and that's an equal duty to their presenting their gift. Those are simultaneous things, you know. You can't oblige someone to present something you aren't going to use, you know. Like, well, my gift really is dance. Well, we need someone to wash the linens. Would you be willing to? No, I'll dance on them, you know. But what do you want? But this idea of an obligation, he says, put on the full armor of God so as to be able to resist the devil's tactics. Now, Paul will oftentimes speak in terms of the devil, and that was very, very common in the teaching of Jesus too. But you need to know that in the world in which they lived, everything that went wrong, the devil did it, you know. You would really need the devil to be on top of everything to do kind of what's going on. St. Augustine, in one of his writings, said that he believes in the devil. It's doctrine. So he says, I believe in the devil, and I believe the devil has the authority to do certain things in the world and this sort of thing. But he says, I don't believe the devil is really involved in me. And, you know, he had a lot of moral problems. He says, I don't really believe the devil's involved in me. I have enough wrong with me to go to hell on my own. And I think that's really true of all of us. You know, it'd be so good to use the Flip Wilson thing every time it happens. The devil made me do it, you know. It'd be so simple, but that's kind of erroneous. So anyway, he says, be able to resist the devil's tactics. Okay, what would the devil's tactics be? The devil's tactics would be for a person to lord their gift in the church and to make it a very big thing. I'll give you an example. In the Catholic Church, with the rise of the charismatic movement, I've been involved in the charismatic movement for 50 years. So that was the time it began. So as the charismatic movement, one of the things it did was start communities. The largest one built was Ann Arbor, and I think there are about 6,000 members. And they would come together and did all kinds of things. There was a big one in Scottsdale, Arizona, and stuff. And I watched all of them collapse. And the reason they collapsed is that when people came together to form the community, each one of them had in their mind the idea of what would make the perfect community. And then there was fights with regards to leadership. And whoever became leader, his model of community was imposed. And like in Ann Arbor, you reached a point where the person in head of the community was telling people who to marry. I mean, it was really, really bizarre. But he reached this, and ultimately, it's destroyed. When you study communities, the primary community and the model for all communities is a marriage. And so you always think in terms of a marriage. Now, what happens if a man knows exactly who's in charge of the household and how a marriage is supposed to work, and a wife knows exactly who's in charge of the household and how it's supposed to work, and those two people get married? We call that a divorce, okay? That is not going to work. It doesn't work at all. What happens is two people come together and they will create the relationship that is that marriage, okay? And you think about, I'm thinking of the fundamentalists in the Midwest, okay, where the man's in charge and you set that whole thing up. Well, what happens when the man's drafted and has to go off to the war? Well, the woman was totally in charge of everything for the period. Then the man came back and thought he was supposed to be in charge again, That there's just crazy things. As a marriage, I really love the model, because a man and woman come together and they form basically what a marriage is. And just about the time they have it formed, then a baby's born. Then you have to work out a whole system, and you have to do it while sleep deprived, okay? And you get that going, and then you have another child, or someone loses a job, or someone gets sick. And as a couple, you always adjust to that. You can't just decide this one's sick, we'll move. You don't do it. You think of it, but I mean, you don't do that. And that, we have to understand that's the way the church is. Like a lot of people are very upset about changes and stuff you see in the church. This is not the 18th century. This is a different world. And how do we live this faith in this world? And the leaders of the church, certainly, during my lifetime, the thing I am most thankful for in my entire life is because I have a knowledge of history, that we have had the longest period in all of history of saints, popes. So I can look at the whole world and watch it turning to crap and know that the leader of my faith is a saint. And people I completely disagree with their theology and stuff, like Pope Benedict, or Pope John Paul near the end of his life, I really disagreed with their point of view, but I would not deny the fact they were saints. They were very holy people. And it's an amazing thing that the church is guided by those in this period. And to be able anyway to look at that. But the devil has all kinds of tactics he uses with us. I'll add one more thing, and I probably have told you this before, but my grandmother was a full-blooded Native American, and she used to do pottery. And she didn't do it the Indian way, which is a coil and then round again. what she threw pots. So she would throw the pot, and what used to drive us crazy is that when she would get the pot thrown, she would not fire it, sometimes for 2 years. And then she would fire it. And I don't know how many of you know about pottery or have ever fired it, but first of all, once you do a pot is going to lose about 20% of its size drying. And then you put the slip on the outside, the slip that you put on the outside, the color will be determined by how close it is to the source of heat. You have the same slip on 2 different pots, you get 2 different colors. And how quickly the heat goes up and how quickly it comes down. Those determine all the colors. Well, what my grandmother told me, because I asked her about it, my grandmother told me, she says, Jimmy, when you create a pot, you have to have a really strong vision in your mind, or you aren't inspired to make a pot. So you have some design of a pot, and then you need to make it, and you get your pot made. But you should never fire the pot till you've forgotten that, because by definition, that is not going to be what comes out of the flames. And if you still have that in your mind, you'll look at it and you'll say, well, that isn't this pot, so it's therefore a bad pot. And that ain't necessarily true. This could be a perfectly wonderful pot. It just isn't what you had in your mind. And the same thing with regards to the church, with regards to a marriage, with regards to a family. You need to be always look, is this good? This isn't, what I daydreamed about. And I would say that's always true with children. No matter how you raise them or train them or anything, that is not exactly what you envisioned. But who cares? The question is it good? Like I look at my parents. My parents were very frustrated with my sister, who was absolutely brilliant. But my sister wanted to raise horses. She loved animals. And my parents were Nazis on education. So they ordered her to go to school, get a degree. So again, my sister was a genius. She went to UC Berkeley, got a doctorate in physics with a minor in math. Then got married, raised horses the rest of her life. And she raised and trained quarter horses. And, my parents, at the end, I remember my father told me this when he was dying. He says, the glory of our lives, and he was referring to my mother and he said, is that we raised 2 happy people. That was the glory of their life, Not that they were disappointed in me because the name ends with me. There has not been another male in the system at all. They're cousins. So they were disappointed that the name was going to end initially, and disappointed my sister was into the horsey business. But as a matter of fact, we both ended up very, very happy. My parents, and I say this, honestly, my parents were better parents than they were spouses. They ended up divorcing. They were not very good spouses, but they were very good parents, in that thing. But this idea of somehow escaping what you think is supposed to, a pastor, you should allow a parish to develop. Don't, define it. He says, for our struggle is not against human enemies, but against rulers, authorities, and the cosmic powers of this darkness, the spirits of evil in the heavenly places. And this idea of what's going on, I'm sure you're familiar with that famous place in Europe where Europe used to be a huge bunch of little tiny countries, and probably the only 2 I know that are left are Liechtenstein and Monaco, okay? But it used to be just a huge bunch of these things. And they were always having wars and everything. And one time, when 2 of them wanted to go to war, they decided to settle it by a chess game. The dukes of the 2 things were both chess players. But, everybody's fate was on the line. So what they did was they created a chessboard out in the town square, and they had people dressed as the chessmen, And the two princes played the game up in the palace, and the moves were carried down to the people so they would, see what was going on. And I think that's kind of the way we need to understand our world, that you and I see, the difficulties and stuff, all that. But what's going on is a contest between good and evil, or God and Satan, however you want to put it. And we are just pawns in that. And that's why to be very careful about the movement. We had to listen very carefully, Don't ask a pawn how to play chess, okay? That we're supposed to listen to the master and to understand it's not as simple as it looks. It looks very simple here, but there's something very complex and very powerful going on. And we're called to be part of it. He says, therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you may be able to resist the devil on the evil day. With full exertion, you'll be able to stand your ground. So he says there are a lot of, resources at your disposal. He's going to go through some of these. But he says you have to be very, very careful to actually use the resources. I think it's funny that if you look at paintings, it's very, very common for an artistic point of view, to paint a man, let's say in a breastplate of metal, a skirt usually of cloth, and then bare legs, bare arms, no helmet, and a sword. That man's not going to last very long. He's a great model, but this is not, he's not going to survive in the war. And the thing is, there are a lot of things at your disposal, and don't just pick out, what you want or this sort of thing. I look good in a breastplate, so that's what we're. No, that's not quite the way it works. Okay, he says, truth is the belt around your waist. Okay, so first of all, he calls us to truth. And this is a very, very important thing biblically, that remember what it says, blessed are the pure in spirit, for they shall see God. A pure in spirit means to be honest. The Greek term for a liar is you have a double heart. So pure of spirit means you're single-hearted. You have one heart, and you're honest. And what is it? The reward for that is that you see God. Sigmund Freud did a commentary on the Beatitudes at one time, and Sigmund Freud said that people who are liars never actually see another person, let alone ever see God. And the reason is, when you tell me about yourself, if when I tell you about me, there are all these huge exaggerations, I'll suspect that's what you're doing. So I won't really know you, because I won't believe what you tell me about yourself. And see, that's what happened with Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees were all pretending to be so much better than they were, that when Jesus came on, they presumed he was pretending too. But he wasn't, And so you and I want to be truthful. And because if we are not truthful, we lose the ability to recognize truth, okay? It just comes out. So we want to be truthful. And second, wearing the breastplate of righteousness. Now, righteousness has to do with justice, okay? And again, let me go back to my dad and the ice cream story, okay? Justice there was a wrong done, it needed to be rectified, and it was over with. Yeah, I didn't cease to be his son because of that. I didn't cease to be involved in the family because of that. That wouldn't have been righteousness. But to punish me for what I did was righteousness. And we need to recognize this idea of righteousness in society and the way things go on in tremendous. Like, I'm looking at that on the news today about that black guy who was 23 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit, and he's just been released. I'm thinking, how do you restore that? What could you possibly do? I think he was 18. So if he was 18 and he went to jail for 23 years, that would make him 40. Imagine missing that period of your life. But anyway, you and I want to be people who are about righteousness. There's always the temptation to get even when we're offended and stuff like that. But the idea is be righteous, okay? It's possible in defending to actually commit a greater crime than was committed in the first place. He says, on your feet, readiness for the gospel of peace. And this idea of remembering that the basic gospel of Jesus is peace, that it's love and it's peace. And if we're talking about an individual, what does God ask of me as an individual? He asks me to love God and to love my neighbor as strong as I love God, to love my neighbor with the love I have for God, okay? And that's what he asks of me. What does he ask of me standing beside a person? Peace. Peace is what he wants between us, okay? And so this two things, be very aware that this is a gospel of peace. And when you read that, think of how often you have heard a preacher use the gospel like a hammer with someone, okay? Remember, it's to be a gospel of peace. He says, in all circumstances, bearing the shield of faith, with which you're able to quench the burning arrows of the evil one. Faith is a shield, because faith gives me ultimately what to believe. I believe God. Ultimately, I believe God. And as long as I believe God, like for instance, the evil that's going on in the world, I believe a God who told me I'm saved. I believe a God who said that ultimately it'll work out. I believe a God who's told me to act in a certain way. I choose to believe that. It's a choice. And he said, finally, he says, take up the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. This helmet of salvation is, you understand, the helmet is what protects the most important part of your body, which is your head. And it's salvation. The most important part about you, like if you could go through the whole thing, is that you've been promised you'll live forever. That's salvation. Your life is guaranteed. Okay, that you have the guarantee on. And that's wearing that helmet and knowing that when you go through it. One of the famous quotes when Thomas More was up for on trial because he wouldn't confirm Henry VIII's marriage, the guy who was in charge of the trial said to Thomas More, he said, if you will confirm the marriage, we can allow you life. We can allow you to live. And Thomas said, it makes no sense to give up what you cannot lose, which is everlasting life, what can't be taken away from you, to get something you can't give. He says, you can't guarantee tomorrow of my life. I could have a heart attack right today. There's no way you can give me life. And there's no way you can take everlasting life away from me. So it would be insane to give up the one for the other. Absolutely insane. And to understand this when we go through the world, that we have this helmet. And this idea of the sword of the Spirit, if you read the book of Revelation, you'll notice that when the Son of God returns, that out of his mouth is coming a sword. The symbol of Scripture in the Bible is the sword. The sword is the symbol of Scripture. And so that's why that's seen so to be developed or taken in the Scriptures. So we'll stop it there, and that's chapter 6 and verse 18. And we will ultimately finish this next week, I promise. Okay? Does anyone have a particular book they'd like to go to from here? Anyone at all? Okay. If no one has a suggestion, What I would like to cover is the Song of Songs. I'd like to do that. Okay? And I'll explain it when we come next week. And if I forget what the book is, which I might do, you just remind me of it when we come back. Any questions?